Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who of course is a Democrat, says he's throwing in his hat and is running for president as an independent. So he's starting his campaign off and is talking directly to black men because black men have been very vocal that they are no longer interested in voting Democrat. I believe RFK went to talk to black men because they've been very supportive of Trump, but they haven't asked for anything for their vote. So neither party knows what empty promises to put out there to get black men to vote for them. So RFK Jr. enters the scene, and he had a conversation with this panel of black men who I'm sure have positioned themselves as the intelligent, top tier, or high-value men. But after listening to this discussion, the truth and the facts of why the black community is in shambles and headed towards a second slavery is laid out in these conversations. There was actually too much degeneracy for one video, so this will be a series of videos from this one conversation. In this conversation, RFK was asked about his opinion on reparations, and in response, RFK is basically against cash reparations, and he's telling them how working together with other men in the community is the answer. And he's offering knowledge of how his old neighborhood in Bed-Stuy, New York, was a poor neighborhood that became financially stable and upwardly mobile due to the hard work of the men getting together and creating businesses. I don't believe that he or any of his colleagues didn't have access to capital. He is a Kennedy, America's royal family. So if you listen closely, he's describing poor black neighborhoods, and he's giving advice on how these neighborhoods can become successful. But these black men aren't hearing any of this because putting in hard work and working with other black men are two components black men will never achieve.
And my father fell in love with that community. And actually, Arthur Schlesinger, who wrote the most famous biography of my father, said that in that book that when Robert Kennedy was not at home, the place that he wanted to be more than any other was Bedford-Stuyvesant. And what he saw in that community is that there was this entrepreneurial spirit where people, wanted to be in business, and they were innovative and energetic, but they didn't have access to capital, and they were redlined from the banks. The banks would not make loans in that area. They were redlined from insurance companies, car insurance, and a lot of other things that were disadvantages. The big disadvantage, they didn't have access to capital, and they did not have access to knowledge to my father, grew up among people where if he needed to call somebody from Harvard Business School to ask a business problem, he could call somebody. Mm-hmm. But there was no access in that neighborhood to that. So a businessman who was smart and everything, but did not have, he didn't have that accumulated access to that kind of to business knowledge. So my father put together a group of top-level businessmen, Andre Mayer from Lazard Frères, Tom Watson from IBM, and a bunch of others, and got them to make a commitment to come to Bed-Stuy regularly and to mentor businesses.
Black people in general have not practiced building generational wealth. But isn't it about time that we do? All other ethnicities practice what RFK is preaching, and we see the difference in their quality of life while we're still begging for handouts. I do believe we deserve to receive reparations, but if generational wealth is the goal, then cash payments is not the answer, in my opinion. Building grocery stores, banks, hospitals, schools, recreation centers works because it allows the dollar to bounce within the neighborhood multiple times so that everybody benefits. But the black community is the only community where the men don't want to be the leaders. They want to live under the patriarchy of another group of men.
We bought the Pathmark store there when I first went out there. The closest grocery store was 75 blocks, 3 bus rides. So a woman who was trying to feed her kids had to get on 3 buses, get her loads of grocery, climb back on those buses at 75 blocks. And we got Pathmark to move into Restoration Plaza, which changed a lot of people. And then we built a theater there. We built, sports centers and we started giving access to microloans, to grants. But the last time I was there, Fulton Street was thriving. There were, all of these storefronts were crowded.
Yeah.
And that is good not only for the Black community, but it's good for everybody.
Wouldn't it be great if your children received high-quality education and you don't have to worry about a drag queen coming to read to your children and indoctrinating them into their community? And where Black people can rely on other Black people to give them jobs, or be able to get loans from Black-owned banks without being discriminated against. Wouldn't it be great to have your baby in a hospital with doctors who look like you and care whether you survive labor? Because in this wealthy, first world country, Black women have the highest maternity mortality rate.
And what we saw is the tribes that put it into institutions like clinics, scholarships, business loans, microloans, building factories, those things, those tribes really flourished. The communities flourished.
Right.
And that sense of community was great. And all the tribes that did cash payments was a catastrophe.
Dr. Claude Anderson said Black people will be the underclass in America in 2015. Well, that was almost 10 years ago. RFK's prediction is at the 20-year mark for the second wave of slavery for Black people, because your government is diligently working to put Black people back into slavery, and their 30-year plan is now at the 20-year mark.
The community is being systematically stripped. I'd say I think I saw a statistic recently, by 2040, the value of equity in Black communities is going to be 0. Because there's a systematic stripping of equity out of of ownership,
Right.
of wealth, and that is the same thing as slavery ultimately. That reaction.
I hear you, and I hear exactly where you're coming from. But I got to say, with all due respect, we in the Black community, I'll speak for myself, but I think there's other people I speak for too. We in the Black community are not really overly concerned about the feelings of other people who are polarized by the idea of us getting cash reparations back. If that hurts your feelings, that's kind of on you. And
Right.
I'm not really, and I'm also, just to continue to circle the wagons, I'm also not really overly interested in what's good for everybody when I start talking about reparations. When we start having that conversation, I'm concerned about what's good for the Black people who have always been systemically behind the 8 ball.
Right.
Due to people who will deny that system even exists. They'll tell you there is no systemic racism. They'll tell you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which don't exist. That's
After they've stolen your boots, right?
what I'm not even wearing boots. So, please, I completely get what you're saying, and that is one way to do it. But I don't want our financial future, or not even, maybe not even financial future, but I don't want reparations contingent on how another group feels about it, or how another group is going to look at it or get upset about it. Like, I think maybe if we admit to the 800-pound gorilla in the room and what that represents and what it's done and what it's continuing to do, maybe now that it's out on the table, we can deal with it, and maybe reparations won't hurt so bad if we're not trying to rewrite the history, if we're not trying to pretend that these things don't exist, there is no systemic racism, you just need to work harder, you had a Black president, so it's not that bad. Like, maybe if we knock that stuff off, reparations won't feel so bad if you get that we're really just paying back what we already said we were doing.
So why even go on this emotional tangent? Why can't they act like grown men, stick to the subject, and get something done? At this point, Black people don't have time to address the 800-pound elephant in the room. And if we had our own thriving communities, the 800-pound elephant wouldn't bother us.
Nobody asked us how we felt about that, so I'm not of the mind to consider other people when I'm looking out for what's good for my brothers and sisters in this struggle with me, because when the cops show up, it's just us. When we're being over-policed, it's just us. When we're receiving higher sentences, it's just us. Nobody else is jumping in. When we get a treatment plant near our communities, it's just us. When we get pollution, it's just us. When our water's poisoned, when Flint can't get clean water, just us. Nobody else pulls up and says, hey, well, wait a minute. And I'm not saying other people don't support, but no one else is being asked how they feel about what's happening to us. So when it's something for us, I don't want to have to consider how someone else is going to be made to feel by the fact that 40 acres and a mule is now coming back to the people who never got it. I don't want to have to ask that question. I don't think it's fair that we should have to bear that emotional burden or have that on our conscience. I don't think we should be made to empathize with, feel bad about getting something that we were stiffed on.
Right.
No one else does that.
If he could get out of his feelings and realize that if he lived in a financially sustaining community, Black people wouldn't have to worry about high crime, sewage in the water, being over-policed, and pollution in the air. And since he's the loudest one with pushback, I was anxiously waiting for him to give his ideas on how best to handle the reparations questions. But just as I thought, he never got to it. He was long-winded, emotional, he was repetitious, and he came with no solutions.
What about the Blacks that own slaves?
What about them? I don't want to split those hairs either. Like these were people who were living. These were
But
people.
that's a good question. We have descendants of those, which I'm sure we could tell you that they were actually slave owners.
And there's always one ready to derail and all lives the conversation. The first question hasn't even been answered yet, and he's bringing in another question that doesn't need to be answered.
Building back the community, definitely key. But who's in control of that?
The first question a Black man has is, what white man do I sign my life over to? And that's because we don't have any leaders in this community. And this is how white people take advantage of us. Black men don't believe in higher education. They don't believe in working hard, and they don't believe in community. And I'm going to keep repeating that it's time for Black women to accept the role of leadership and become the decision makers that the community needs.
Well, I mean, the theory is, and I believe that it bears out, when you create businesses that you enrich the whole community. You can look at this barbershop, and the community that it's created in here, through the existence, or a grocery store, and how important it is. There's a gourmet deli across the street. If that disappeared, imagine how bad it would be for this community. Because I saw what happened in Bed-Stuy when there was no place to buy. Every business that you build enriches the community more. It enriches everybody in the community.
But we don't
But
own
you're
these
doing
businesses.
it in an organic way.
That's the next.
We don't
that's the
own
next-
these businesses.
That's the next key.
town is
That
right.
dairy
Right.
store is not owned by us.
Black people have been asking, begging, threatening, marching, and protesting to get our oppressor to give us money, to repair the damage that was done to us. But because we haven't leveraged our collective power, they are not swayed. And why should they be? This group of men want to simply receive cash payments, then go live in white communities under their patriarchy. And giving them money is not going to make them work hard. It's not going to repair their enslaved minds. And it's certainly not going to make them want to be with a black woman, have black children, and build and repair black communities. The power to collectively remove our money from their communities is key. And we would do that by putting in the work and building our own businesses in our communities. And actually, we're already doing the work, but independently, and we haven't put forth a collective effort. So, black women, you have to ask yourself, are you going to sit back and let your children be the next generation of slaves? And again, just because we're unwilling to fight doesn't mean we're not at war.